that you loved before. Monstrosities Mon Amour.
Watcher, welcome to Monstrosities Mon Amour, where we celebrate the things that give other people the right ump. I'm John Grindrod, a writer of strange obsessions and excitable geekery. I'll be meeting people who will share their enthusiasm for monsters, major and minor, places that get a bad press, and cultural artefacts that need to be rescued from the dustbin of popular opinion. Today, I've been kidnapped by design and feature journalist Helen Barrett. She's bundled me into the boot of her Austin Maxi to take me somewhere beyond my wildest imaginings. Hello, Helen.
Hi.
So this is it? Where the hell are we?
We are in the centre of Swindon, and we are in a place called the Brunel Centre, which is a vast 1970s shopping centre.
Cool. And I can see, as I look around, we've got a bit of a barrel vault going on above us.
This is the roof of the Brunel Centre, which is designed to look like Paddington Station. It's a big glass and steel contraption. I think it looks a bit like Milan, but it was designed to echo Paddington Station. And the Brunel Centre grew out of what was the Swindon Railway Village, the 19th century residential area that grew up around the railway works.
And I guess that's the thing that, if you know anything about Swindon, you're going to know about the railway history, aren't you?
The railway works were once the largest manufacturing plant in the world. And a lot of it was raised in the 1970s. And the Brunel Centre grew out of it. It was an attempt to modernise Swindon. But it was also built very carefully to echo the history, that manufacturing history. I'm going to make the case for Swindon as a kind of magical place. It's somewhere that until very recently was full of industry and optimism and experimental architecture and progressive planning. And I even think there's a bit of the American Midwest in Swindon, in the English West Country. Obviously, it started with Brunel in the 19th century and the railway works, and some of that is still there. Some of that material evidence is still there. But later Swindon became a town sort of between London and Bristol, which was about financial services and cars and energy. So this was later in the 20th century. It had a sort of renaissance, and the Brunel Centre was contemporaneous with that renaissance.
And your sort of experience of Swindon, when did you first go to the Brunel Centre, and what did you think of it?
Well, I'm not from Swindon, but my dad was from Swindon. He grew up in Swindon, and a lot of my extended family were from Swindon, and I spent a lot of childhood holidays there. And I grew up in the north of England, but Swindon always struck me as a kind of magical place. It always seemed so modern because there were things in Swindon like the Oasis Leisure Centre, which was the most extraordinary piece of proto-high-tech architecture, is still there, still standing.
High-tech architecture being, this form of late modernist architecture where everything is done with as light materials as possible, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And in the 70s, it also seemed somewhere where people had a lot of money. Everybody was employed in quite well-paid industries. The Swindon of my remembering and imagination is very different from how it is perceived today. It's now often a punchline, much like Stoke-on-Trent, Croydon, Essex. But I think there's a particular derision of Swindon. And I think that's got something to do with its proximity, because Swindon, it's not about pleasure and beauty like Bath, which is its near neighbour. And it's not about sort of elite academia like Oxford, which is slightly to the north. It's nothing like the streaming Wiltshire Downs or the Shishi Cotswolds or anything like that. It's something different, and it's somewhere concerned with modernity and productivity. It's less welcoming, and it's less sort of eager to impress. And it's somewhere whose contribution is more prosaic. I think part of Swindon's image problem is down to its proximity to more prosperous cities and that contrast. And it's somewhere that tends to be slightly left-wing, which is a bit of an anomaly in the part of the south where it is. But I think place derision, I mean, I think you agree with me on this, that place derision has consequences, because if a place is disregarded, if a place becomes a punchline, it becomes much, much easier to disregard and destroy anything of value in that place.
Absolutely. People, it becomes very easy, I think, if you live somewhere to sort of feel slightly embarrassed about defending it, and then therefore you get fewer and fewer people defending it, because if you do stick your head up, you sort of feel, people are very ready to kind of tear you and it down, and actually it becomes sort of competitive destruction going on among people, actually really enjoying, sort of gleefully enjoying burning it down rather than trying to kind of defend it in a positive way, or just have a realistic idea of what the place is like. It's sort of interesting how artificial a lot of that performative negativity is.
Yeah, there are certain buildings in Swindon, two in particular, the Oasis Leisure Centre and something called the Mechanics Institute. And once you understand the history and the significance of those two buildings, you would be amazed to learn that they are both in severe states of neglect, that they're at risk of destruction, that there are endless ongoing battles to try and preserve them. And I think the problem with place derision is that it kind of contributes to all of this. It gives powerful people the opportunity to simply disregard buildings and material history. This sort of the neglect that happens in Swindon would not happen in Bath or Oxford, for example.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? That it's a sort of feedback loop, isn't it? Of that, in a place that is quite prosperous, it kind of generates more prosperity, and in a place where there are kind of vulnerabilities, actually that just opens it up to more and more sort of negative stuff happening to it, doesn't it?
That's right, and I just honestly think Swindon deserves better.
Quite right too. I love a bit of Swindon, having spent quite a lot of time at WH Smith's head office in Swindon over the years. I just think it's one of those places that, also coming from Croydon, I really recognise it as a place that just is a sort of byword for something that it actually isn't. And that is really frustrating. I mean, that is so frustrating. I feel bad in a way, that, we're talking about Swindon in the context of, the word monstrosity. And clearly, nobody in their right mind would call Swindon a monstrosity. But its image problem is the energy escaping from a place, which has happened to so many towns. It then becomes quite hard to build it back up and to make people excited about it again and reinvent it. But the interesting thing that you've already said, is that we've got all these different waves of excitement in Swindon. It's sort of this very modern place. I like what you were saying about it being kind of quite American. I mean, in what sense does it feel like the Midwest?
Well, maybe not so much. I mean, there's no denying the rundown sort of feel of much of the centre of Swindon now, particularly the new centre. For those who don't know Swindon, the centre is the new town, and there's an old town, what was the original market town, which is kind of way up on the hill, which is still very nice and quite chic-y. But I'm talking now about the new town, which is where the Brunel Centre was, and is all very, very sort of mid to late 20th century. Swindon was absolutely pulverised by the Luftwaffe in the war because of the railway works, and so a lot of its reconstruction came after that in the way that many towns and cities did. One of my favourite Swindon memories is staying with an elderly great aunt and she lived in the railway village. In a kind of very old railway cottage, 19th century cottage, and she was born right at the end of the 19th century. And for some reason, Swindon was one of the first places in the country, I think, to get cable television in the 80s. So this was in the mid 80s. And we went to see and I just remember she had, this elderly great aunt in this Victorian house had MTV. In kind of like 1984 or something, and this is just like mind-blowing. This is just kind of fantastic. But Swindon seemed to be full of all these things. It was full of way before other places, it seemed to have bowling alleys and multiplexes and leisure centres on a vast scale, drive-in movie. It had all this stuff. And the other crazy thing I remember is in the Brunel Centre, and I'll come back to the Brunel Centre because I think, it does reflect a lot of this. In the Brunel Centre was a branch of Chelsea Girl, much missed Chelsea Girl, the fashion chain.
Which sadly, in my memory, got replaced by River Island.
The
drabbest possible fashion shop.
Before River Island was River Island, it was Chelsea Girl, which was the epitome of cool. And in the 70s and I think into the 80s, the branch of Chelsea Girl in Swindon, it had a vast branch and it had a sort of psychedelic frontage, which was like a sort of flowing kind of plastic perspex kind of abstract bit of pop art stuck on the front of this shop. So you walked in through what seemed like a psychedelic tunnel. And this was, it was like a bit of the East Village in the West Country. It was just crazy.
Amazing stuff. Theatrical gesture going on there. But that's one of the things that really strikes me about Swindon is there is quite a lot of theatricality to a lot of these places, that they're not just functional history, considering that, as you say, that Bath and Oxford nearby, performative grandeur everywhere. But Swindon has got kind of a lot of buildings that have got a big kind of theatrical resonance to them in a way, haven't they? They kind of make a real impact on you when you see them.
Totally. The Brunel Centre, so you look up and you've got this vast kind of roof, glass and steel roof that emulates a railway shed. And you look down and the floor is black and white piano key tiling. And it's like a piece of op art. It's like standing in the middle of a Bridget Riley. It's quite dizzying and incredible. The scale of this stuff.
Is that advisable when people have been doing quite a long shopping trip? To actually just be suddenly spiralling into the floor like they're in vertigo.
And there's these sort of set piece delivery bits on either side of the Brunel Centre, which are like massive concrete snail shells, which were where lorries delivered made deliveries up through, and then they sort of dropped them off on the roof of the Brunel Centre. And these concrete snail shells still exist. They're huge, kind of like urban sculptures. They're, quite amazing things, really. And it's not just me that likes Swindon, because Ian Nairn was fond of Swindon as well. In 1978, there's a bit of film called from Nairn's Journeys called Finding Follies Twixt London and Bristol.
Ian Nairn, we should say, is an amazing kind of architecture writer and broadcaster from like the mid-20th century, wasn't he? He was an absolute extraordinary character who just seems to have kind of stumbled out of a hedge into doing that, and then stumbles back into a hedge again immediately afterwards. It's quite an incredible kind of persona he's got, in these things, and this amazing take he has on any place that he sort of ends up. And you never really know where it's going to go, or what he's going to think, or what he's going to say, or is he going to love it? Is he going to hate it? We don't know. It's a kind of roulette kind of thing going on with him, isn't there?
Yeah, and his hair's all over the place, and it's just fantastic. But in this particular episode, when he goes to Swindon, he does actually he follows the railway line. So he follows Brunel. He talks about Brunel being his hero. And he follows the railway line from Paddington to Bristol, and he stops off along the way. And the place he spends the longest amount of time at is Swindon. And we sort of join him sitting on a bench under the statue of Brunel in the Brunel Centre. And the Brunel Centre is newly opened at this point. It started in the early 70s. It was one of those things that took a decade. It finally finished in 1979. But he's in the centre of the new town, and he berates the viewer. He says, "Swindon, you must be joking, but of all the millions of you that have gone through on the train, how many of you have actually got out and had a look at Swindon?" He's a defender. He sees the value in it. He goes on to find something of the great cities of Europe in the Brunel Centre. He talks about it being like Paris, and he spends a long time looking at a beer delivery truck trying to reverse around an old street. And he says, this is like Paris, this is city life. And he admires the very sort of prosaic hardware shops and a row of sort of very ordinary shops. And he says, this is where people get a start in life. And he romanticizes it. It is a it's a romantic piece of television, but he's right. And I find it quite moving to watch. He says of the Brunel Centre, he says, it's been put to me that this is plastic Brunel. I won't wear that one. I think it's very decent. I think they've tried. And I don't like indoor shopping centres, but if you're going to have one, that one is about as good as I've seen anywhere.
Given that he could go either way on stuff, and if he didn't like something, my word, he didn't like it.
Yeah.
So to have that very kind of like romantic response to the place, it's really authentic, isn't it? I mean, it really, that he really feels that stuff. Yeah. It's not manufactured, is it?
No.
I imagine he would have been less keen on the cable TV, but
yeah, probably.
But there we are. Yeah. But obviously, Brunel Centre is just one of the kind of incredible late 20th century buildings there. There's also the Renault Centre, which is another remarkable place.
This is one of my favourite buildings in Swindon. This is not in the centre. It's on the outskirts. It was built in 1982. It's now Grade 2 star listed. It's a Norman Foster building that was built for Renault, the car manufacturer, as a distribution centre for the United Kingdom. So part of it was a car warehouse, I suppose, and the other part of it was sort of administrative. For those who've never seen it, it's a very long, low building that sits very low in the landscape. It's got a bright yellow Meccano-esque structure supporting it. Owen Hatherley, who's an architectural writer, wrote about it. He said it's a very long steel shed in a bleak suburban site of office parks and noddy houses. From a distance, I think the roof seems to hover because it's suspended by these sort of tubular masts and tensile steel cables, and it's kind of got this exoskeleton of steel beams. I think it's as good as the Sainsbury's Centre, perhaps more so, which is another Norman Foster building that was built roughly a decade earlier in Norwich.
And it's quite different, isn't it? In the Sainsbury's Centre is like incredibly sort of smooth and sleek, whereas this building, it's got all that exposed kind of masts and stuff. It's like a giant sort of ship with rigging, isn't it? We're used to his enormous buildings in the centre of great cities around the world, and we're not necessarily used to him building kind of, factory units in Swindon. That's not what he's known for. And also, he's not known for kind of this style of architecture either, really. Usually everything's very hidden away.
Yeah.
And in this one, it's all sort of exposed and out there, isn't it? It's sort of, the exoskeleton, as you say, sort of like holding it all up. It's like this great big, another great big theatrical gesture.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I visited the Norman Foster Foundation offices in Madrid this year.
Fancy.
It's in a very grand villa in a very upmarket part of Madrid. It's very quiet. It's hidden behind a big wall, and you go through these sort of secret gates, and there are lots of very chic young people in black sort of pointing you around, and it's all very hushed. And it's inside this grand mansion are all his models. There's a polished floor, and there's white walls and chandeliers. It's quite an extraordinary place, and all the great models are on display on sort of vast tables. So there's the Reichstag and the Gherkin and the Hearst Tower and all these things. And I went into one room, and in pride of place, right in the middle, is the Renault Centre, the model of the Renault Centre in Swindon. And it was just a joy to see. He obviously really likes it. I mean, I interviewed him for the Telegraph about something entirely different, but in the interview, sort of afterwards, I mentioned to him how much I loved the Renault Centre. He just looked at me blankly.
Amazing. Do you think that he was looking at you blankly in a why, or in a I've totally forgotten that exists?
I don't know. didn't like to ask. But I asked him what his favourite building was of his, and he mentioned a docker. It's long gone, but he built a sort of a dockers clubhouse in the 70s, I think, somewhere in the old London Docklands. And it was supposed to be where the dockers could find rest and relaxation. And some of those ideas were brought over to the Renault Centre, because the idea behind the Renault Centre is that the blue-collar workers are no different from the white-collar workers, that everybody sits on the same level. And it was that seamlessness. There was a sort of a social aspiration to it, that there would be a seamlessness, that each side of the business was just as valuable, and that's reflected in the architecture. And I think the other thing about the Renault Centre, so it's now a soft play centre. It's called Kids About, and you go to it, you sort of drive up, and you can park there, and you can just go in. I mean, it helps if you have a small child with you. It's just full of kids bouncing around and screaming, and and it kind of lends itself to a soft play area because it's so much fun as a building. It's exciting, it's dramatic, and we talk about adaptive reuse. And everybody gets excited about Battersea Power Station and Tate Modern and all those things. Honestly, if you want to see adaptive reuse that makes a difference to people's lives, then you could really look no further than the Renault Centre.
Amazing. It's sort of interesting as well, that idea of the sort of social purpose of the building kind of being very much sort of one of the important functions of that when he was designing it, because that again strikes me as something that's very sweet. The railway village, the Brunel Centre, all these places, are combining a sort of big old function with livability and trying to sort of make it into a place that actually, is meeting the needs of the people who are going to use it. There's a lot of that rather than buildings just being a statement for the sake of it.
Yes.
They're sort of really trying very hard to do lots of different things all at once. And I think that feels like a very Swindon thing, trying to kind of balance all of these, the practical concerns of somewhere while also trying to make it interesting in its own right.
Yeah, and also quite international as well. I mean, it's no coincidence that it was built for a French client, and it was, built at a time of European integration, and all those things. It actually won. I was reading. It's won loads of awards. It's obviously listed. It was in View to a Kill as well. There's a big extension with Roger Moore and Patrick McNee in the thing. So you might know it from View to a Kill in 1984. But
I do love A View to a Kill. I know it's nobody's favourite Bond film, but it kind of is mine, I think.
Yeah, I know, it's great. But the Financial Times used to have an Architecture at Work award, which was before. I mean, I used to work there at the FT, and it was before my time. But it seems like that should be exactly the sort of award that a business newspaper should be doing. I don't know what happened to it. Presumably, it's long gone. But the Renault Centre did win the Financial Times Architecture at Work award. So it's always been recognised. But it's somehow less well known and less celebrated than the Lloyd's Building and the Sainsbury's Centre.
Yeah, that makes it more interesting, doesn't it, in a way, because it's somewhere to discover rather than somewhere we already know loads about, which is great. Do you think, given that, you do write across lots of different subjects, but you write a lot about architecture and design, and do you think that Swindon really helped you appreciate that stuff?
Yeah, I think it did. It helped that my extended family lots of them worked for the railways. So I was always aware of the role that the architecture had played in family history. There's a building in the middle of Swindon, which is a Victorian Gothic slab, which I think is of real national significance. It's called the Mechanics Institute, and it was built in 1855. It's Grade 2 listed. It's a piece of theatre, but from the outside, it's a piece of theatre. But it once held, I think, what was the UK's first lending library. And it was for the mechanics. It was an education centre and cultural centre that was set up specifically for the mechanics to improve their lives. It's this very sort of patrician approach to industry, typical typical Victorian approach. They paid for it themselves. The mechanics paid for it themselves. It had a theatre, a reading room, a lecture hall, facilities for education workers and their families. But later on, it provided healthcare, and it was a kind of proto-NHS because it even offered healthcare to other workers that weren't involved with the railways eventually. It was a sort of proto-NHS, and the Victorian Society calls it the birthplace of the NHS. It's an incredible site. It's a Gothic dream, but it's derelict and it's been empty for 40 years. It's been in private hands since the 80s. It's had a series of private owners. It's been on the at-risk register since 1999. It's constantly falling apart. When you go and see this thing, you can't quite believe that something like this exists, and it still exists, and it's just left. It's just disregarded, and there are endless plans. They never quite happen. The council seems powerless to save it, and this is what you dismiss when you dismiss working places like Swindon, I think.
It's very sad to have these kind of relics of once grand and optimistic visions for the town. So, we just want a bit more love for Swindon. We want people to appreciate, the history of the place and what's there, and actually see that as an amazing positive thing, rather than sort of trying to kind of solve Swindon either by sweeping it all away or just accepting that, decline is what, what it has to live with, So a bit more positivity for Swindon.
Yeah.
That's what we want.
I think so.
Now your minor monster. We've had your major monster. Your minor monster is a bit of a gear change. Tell me, what is it?
It's status quo's down, down.
Amazing. Well, I mean, I'm already on board here straight away.
Yeah, this is a record I absolutely love. I think I can't think of a track that manages to build excitement and anticipation in quite the same way as Down Down. I think Status Quo did this in 1974, where they were absolutely in their pomp. They'd actually been going for 12 years, 14 years, I think, in various incarnations by the time they got to 1974. So they were so tight and so professional in their sound. It's a polished, immaculate record, and it was their only number one in the UK. I think there's a real case for it being a punk antecedent. It's the way they go straight into the deluge of descending guitars. It sounds like nothing else to me. It sounds like nothing else at the time. I think it's certainly on a par with anything the Ramones did, and I love the Ramones. I think Down Down is the Ramones' equal.
It's amazing, and also that kind of relentlessness of it. It's sort of like almost sort of motoric, isn't it? It's got that German kind of like drive to it, hasn't it? And it's kind of like repetitive kind of obsession going on. Yeah. When they're singing again and again and again, it really, it's like, oh my God, it's just going to go on forever.
Yeah, and it's ludicrously theatrical. When I think about bands that I didn't see live, that I stupidly never got round to seeing, there are lots on the list, but among them, pretty high on that list is Status Quo.
If you did see them in the last 20 years, it would have just been like endless anniversary waltzes, wouldn't it? It's like, it's not Down Down. You just wanted to do, if they could just do like a 24-hour Down Down, that's what you want, isn't it? You just want Down Down that never ends because it's so good. But no, I don't really, I could maybe cope with a bit of Pictures and Plastic Men, but I'm not that interested, but Down Down is incredible.
But Status Quo, I mean, they were huge. I mean, they sold 120 million records. And I was looking yesterday for another piece I was working on at Fleetwood Mac's sales. Now, Fleetwood Mac sold 140 million. Well, Status Quo weren't far behind Fleetwood Mac. Fleetwood Mac are absolutely huge, still. And critically acclaimed, regarded. Everybody loves them now. Huge resurgence. Status Quo, nowhere. So they do get overlooked, and I think they're deeply unfashionable because they're kind of a bit establishment, a bit of that sort of bloated 80s music industry Live Aid thing. they're a bit Brexity, maybe, I think, possibly in their appeal. I don't know. They're very male, they're very white. But they were also a working class band, and they were playing to working class audiences. And again, I think that's partly why they're never really going to be regarded in quite the same way as Fleetwood Mac or others from the era.
Yeah. If there's a link between Swindon and Status Quo, it's that idea of having neighbours that are posher than you, looking down on you, and kind of, and you being judged against them, isn't it? Really, I mean, Status Quo have got, Fleetwood Mac is very much the Oxford to Status Quo.
Swindon. Yeah. But I think they're never going to be reappropriated. But I think it's hard to think of a more overlooked record and a piece of British genius, really.
Absolutely. So, Helen, where can people read more of your work?
Right, well, I write mostly in the Financial Times and the Telegraph Arts section and the New York Times, and I've got a website. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm easy to find.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Helen. That's Helen Barrett. And if you enjoyed listening to that, do come back for more, because one thing about Monstrosities is they're always so Moorish. Ta-ta.